What's up guys, Eber here with HowReckon, and let's establish a fact here. Overclocking a CPU or processor is not rocket science, at least for the majority of our audience here. But sometimes you can't ignore key elements that could potentially hurt your CPU's lifespan. That is the core voltage, temperatures, core ratios, etc. But first-time users who are introduced into this new concept might find these elements a little intimidating, or they might want the best performance without tons of trial and error. To overcome the issues and guesswork normally associated with manually overclocking a CPU, motherboard manufacturers have implemented certain steps to auto-overclock a capable unlocked processor. There's now some great software that can be downloaded from the respective website, or you could do it through the BIOS. The intent for this video will be to show how new motherboards and their features can allow first-time users or even experienced users to safely and easily overclock their systems with just a press of a few buttons. But most importantly, we're going to be finding out how well various motherboard manufacturers do that. So let's dive in right after this. What? Is that the View 31? You should put a ring on it.
Yes, time to make it RGB official. Thermaltake Ring High Static Pressure Fans, because your case deserves a ring. Full details in the description below.
Alright, allow me to set the stage for you guys just so you won't get lost by the time I reveal the results. Our roundup features 5 Z270 flagship motherboards from reputable manufacturers like MSI, ASUS, EVGA, ASRock, and Gigabyte. My CPU of choice for testing all these boards will be the Core i5 7600K. This is a popular choice among gamers who crave for high clock speeds because it is one of the best price to performance overclockable chips in the KB Lake lineup. For memory, I decided to go with G-Skill's Trident Z series 32GB kit that's capable of speeds up to 3400 MHz. Along with overclocking the processor, I will also be evaluating the DRAM frequencies, as some motherboards' auto OC settings enable the XMP profile as well. I used the CLC 280 AIO liquid cooler from EVGA to cool the 7600K because auto OC certainly plays around with voltages, and I wanted to ensure I had proper cooling throughout my torture tests. I did test these motherboards inside a closed chassis featuring the S340 case from NZXT, as we'll also be monitoring CPU temperatures using AIDA64. The rest of the components are pretty irrelevant in this case, and that includes the GPU, the power supply, the SSD, and other elements, because none of those play a key role when it comes to overclocking. So let's take a look at our contenders, shall we? First up, let's take a look at our cheapest Z270 based motherboard and then move our way up. This is the ASRock Z270 Taichi that retails for around $220. It's a pretty basic looking board that does not feature a lot of RGB goodness if you're looking for aesthetics, but it does pack a punch when it comes to user upgradable add-ons. It's got 3 M.2 slots that support the PCIe Gen 3 standard, PCIe steel armor reinforcements, dual Intel LAN, a robust B-clock engine that should complement the auto OC procedure. ASRock is focusing this board to be the most reliable in the market because it does feature high-end electrical components that should help with stability for the long run, but I guess the results will tell. Next up, we have the Gigabyte Aorus GA Z270X Gaming 7 motherboard. It's got all the bells and whistles that you would ever need for a board, including RGB lighting through the RAM slots, steel reinforced shielding for the PCIe slots, 2 M.2 connectors for PCIe SSDs, and a single U.2 connector. You also get a high-quality Creative Soundcore 3D DAC, along with killer networking, and the list just goes on. From a physical standpoint, the Aorus board is quite unique, and it's got a white and black color scheme that's not too fancy, but it would fit in well if you're thinking about a Stormtrooper build, but price-wise, you're looking at a $10 premium over the ASRock board. Our next player is MSI's Z270 Gaming M7. It's the top-of-the-line motherboard from MSI's Gaming Z270 series, and for your convenience, we've also featured this particular board in our recent Ultimate Gaming/Editing PC build video. Link is down in the description if you're interested. The Gaming M7 is an interesting addition to the roundup because it does feature a simple and intuitive auto OC function through MSI's Game Boost knob, and check this out. There's a physical knob located at the bottom right-hand corner of the board that you can use to select the presets MSI has programmed to the board already. It's really weird, but at the same time, it's also pretty cool. Just like any other flagship board, expect features like RGB lighting, next generation U.2 connector, 3 M.2 slots, and military-grade components, if you really care about quality. Our second last board is from the mighty folks over at EVGA. Meet the Z270 Classified K that's purely targeted towards enthusiasts who just want to achieve stable overclocks without worrying about fancy aesthetic features like RGB lighting and such. It's an extended ATX motherboard with support for dual M.2 connectors, a quad-core audio processor from Creative, and interestingly enough, you'll find 8-pin CPU connectors to ensure the power reaching the processor is clean and stable. The I/O is fairly limited on the board compared to the competition, and that makes sense because, like I mentioned earlier, this is an enthusiast class board designed for overclocking, and it doesn't come cheap. Priced at $300, it is the most expensive Z270 based motherboard among the 5 that I'm testing out in the video. Actually, there's one more from the folks over at ASUS. Can't forget about them because they do offer a variety of motherboards priced appropriately for the consumers, and they're generally well known for overclocking an Intel-based CPU. My money is on this guy, the Maximus 9 Code, because it looks stealthy AF, and the RGB lighting is very subtle compared to the other 4, plus it features a thermal armor throughout the entire PCB to emphasize the Code branding. Feature-wise, there's just a lot to talk about this board, but I'm just going to go over a few key unique features that water cooling enthusiasts might find attracting. ASUS has implemented dual water temperature headers and flow rate header to feed information to the Fan Expert utility. This way you can constantly monitor the flow rate along with the temperatures of an entire loop. The I/O is jacked with USB ports. There's a USB 3.1 front panel header that some cases can take advantage of. The digital power controller is precisely tuned to deliver the smoothest core voltages, and the rest of the components are made of high quality materials. I can't wait to reveal the test results to you guys, but before we move on, let's take a quick look at our testing methodology. I used AIDA64 to stress test the CPU for 2 hours per motherboard. This was to ensure that the overclock was stable during heavy load situations in real time and that it wouldn't either throttle under load or downclock due to various reasons. CPU core voltage is also a key element to consider here, as many of these boards dynamically adjust the voltage to achieve the best possible clock speed. The higher the voltage, the higher the temperature, and sometimes that could end up potentially shortening the lifespan of your CPU. Luckily, my 7600K stood strong, and I was surprised that I was actually able to complete this roundup since some of the automatic overclocking programs push extreme voltages to the processor in order to achieve stability. So what is considered a winning combination here? Well, that's pretty simple. I'm looking for the software or automatic setting that achieves the highest overclock at the lowest voltage that remains rock solid. Of course, automatic memory overclocking is also beneficial in our books, but some manufacturers avoid that since higher RAM speeds adds another variable into the equation. Now, almost every one of these boards perform their automatic overclocking quite differently. There's some that apply a simple generic one-size-fits-all voltage and core speed boost, while others actually do their own stress testing to customize an overclock for your particular CPU. So now let's walk through each individual board's auto overclocking features along with the results one board at a time. Starting with Gigabyte's Aorus Z270 Gaming 7, I used the Easy Tune option from Gigabyte's App Center, which then opened a separate window that revealed system information along with various presets that can be applied towards the CPU. I chose the auto tuning option and then proceeded to the tuning process. The system rebooted after 30 seconds and it started to stress test the CPU by increasing the core ratios. The maximum it was able to get was 4.8 GHz at 1.272 volts. I ran my standard AIDA64 stress test for 2 hours and it passed with flying colors, averaging around 60C under load and 30C during idle. Unfortunately, the board did not overclock the memory, but I did test out the OC preset for 4.4 GHz. The system passed the stress test, but interestingly enough, the core voltages were sitting around 1.32. That's a mere 0.05 volts higher than the 4.8 GHz overclock I was able to achieve with the auto tuning option. Fascinating, right? Taking a look at the built-in presets in the BIOS, they were fairly limited because, as you can see, the maximum they had available was a 4.6 GHz overclock for the 7600K. I did stress test that option and it passed no problem, yielding those voltages and temperatures, but it did not overclock the memory. Next up, I tested the ASRock Taichi Z270 motherboard. The Auto OC feature was built into the A-tuning software that had to be downloaded from the website. I chose the performance option and proceeded to the advanced tab. From there, I chose the 4.8 GHz OC preset, which was the maximum available, and clicked apply. The system rebooted successfully, applying the preset, but surprisingly, the core voltage was sitting around 1.408. That's a 0.2 increase from what I was able to achieve with the Gigabyte board, and the temps were hovering around 68C. Once again, that's a 10-degree difference from the Gigabyte board. That being said, this did not pass my stress test. As you can see, the CPU downclocked to 4.6 GHz and it remained at that frequency over the course of my 2-hour test. Now for my second attempt, I applied the 4.7 GHz OC preset from the A-Tuning app and rebooted the system. Sadly, it was the same story as last time. The CPU downclocked all the way to 4.5 GHz during my stress test, and the core voltage was sitting around 1.36, also yielding temperatures around 62 C, which was a lot lower than 68 with the 4.8 GHz preset. The built-in optimized OC preset was similar to A-Tuning software. I did test out the 4.8 GHz preset, but unfortunately, it wasn't stable under load. FYI, even the core voltages and temperatures remain identical to what was achieved via A-Tuning. Next up, we checked out the MSI Z270 Gaming M7. Auto overclocking can be done through the Command Center, which is MSI's utility for monitoring system specs, including the option to overclock the DRAM. What we're looking for is Game Boost that gives you full access to 8 presets. It also lists what overclock you can expect at each level, which is incredibly handy. I chose set 11 that targeted the 7600K for 4.9 GHz. The system rebooted successfully with that preset, but check out that voltage, 1.507 volts. That's dark territory for the CPU, my friends, and I was reluctant to stress test the system, but I decided to do it anyways, and we see that the CPU downclocks itself to 4.8 under load and temperatures exceeded 80 C. The CLC280 cooler did a fantastic job keeping things under control, and interestingly enough, this was one of the first boards to overclock the RAM to 3300 MHz, but man, the voltage is way too high for the CPU. My second attempt was to test out set 10. That overclocks the chip to 4.8 GHz, but sadly, it did not remain static during the stress test, as it downclocked itself to 4.7. Core voltages were sitting at 1.4, which was still a lot higher than expected, and temps were hovering around 70 C. So that's a 10-degree difference from the 4.9 GHz preset I tested earlier. Now the BIOS for the MSI motherboard is exactly the same as the Game Boost software that we just took a look at, so doing it either way wouldn't really make a huge difference because they feature the exact same presets. Let's now discuss the EVGA Z270 classified motherboard. I had a lot of expectations for this guy because it's purely targeted towards enthusiasts who just want to achieve stable overclocks. But when it comes to auto overclocking, there's not a lot to expect here. Let me show you exactly what I mean. You see, EVGA offers the Elite Tuning Utility X for monitoring system information, but it's essentially EVGA's flavor of CPU-Z with a few options for overclocking. That too had to be done manually by playing around with the core ratios and voltages, as there are no auto OC functionalities. But I was told by EVGA that the BIOS has an auto OC function that automatically sets CPU voltage once you set a CPU multiplier. I gave that a shot since it's not that difficult to enter core ratios. My first attempt was to set it at 50 for a solid 5 GHz overclock. The system booted successfully, applying a core voltage of 1.344, but during my stress test, the CPU downclocked its way down to 4.7. I did try 4.8 and 4.7, but unfortunately, the CPU downclocked its way to 4.5 and 4.4 respectively, with the following voltages shown here. Also, this board did not overclock the memory, which makes sense because EVGA does not offer that feature while auto overclocking the CPU. The last motherboard to test here is the ROG Maximus 9 code from ASUS. I took advantage of the AI Suite 3 utility app that featured the 5-way optimization option. From there, I chose the Extreme Tuning option with TPU1 enabled. This feature plays around with the core ratios and achieves the best possible overclock. After clicking the start button, the system rebooted and the AI utility started stress testing the CPU while simultaneously increasing the core ratios. It's really a smart tool in my opinion because you get real-time stats for your voltage, but it won't proceed until it knows that it's safe to increase the ratio. It took its time and I got to 5 GHz no problem with a core voltage of 1.42 volts. Unfortunately, the CPU downclocked itself to 4.9 during the stress test, but temperatures were well within reach, averaging around 68 degrees. Coming back to the AI Suite app, I wanted to try out the TPU2 option since that adjusts the bus speed of the processor. You won't believe this, but it successfully booted with a 5.1 GHz overclock without crashing. Core voltages and temperatures were the same compared to what I achieved earlier with TPU1, but under load, the CPU once again downclocked to 5 GHz. Also, this board did overclock the memory to 2992 MHz. Compared to MSI's overclock, it's slightly lower, but the fact that it did that is just awesome. The BIOS is just filled with different profiles to overclock the CPU. I chose the golden 5G preset and it was a success. The system stayed rock solid at 5 GHz both under idle and load situations, but it did not overclock the memory this time. Core voltages were slightly higher than the auto overclock, but it was not that significant. So guys, I think it's about time to wrap up my thoughts on auto overclocking 5 of the best Z270 based motherboards. It certainly required a lot of patience, and personally it was a learning experience for me because I learned how to manually overclock a CPU by reading the forums online and watching tutorial videos, and I'm sure most of you did the same thing as well. But this auto OC feature that motherboard manufacturers have implemented into their motherboards is an excellent option, especially for first-time users who really don't want to tinker around with core voltages and core ratios and other elements. It's a great feature to embrace, especially if you're craving for higher gaming performance with just a few clicks, because modern titles these days love higher frequencies. I'm not going to be picking a clear winner here because all these motherboards are great when it comes to manual overclocking. An example, or I guess the worst example that we encountered here was EVGA's Z270 classified board, which costed around $300, and it didn't do that great with the auto overclocking feature. In fact, it did not have an auto overclocking feature because it was just EVGA's built-in feature in the BIOS, and it didn't really work out that great. ASUS, on the other hand, had the best auto overclocking feature with just a button and just a few steps with TPU1 and TPU2. I think that's an excellent option if you really want to take advantage of that board, but again, it's expensive. It's at $300. What really surprised me was the cheapest among them all, the ASRock board, which was super stable. I was easily able to get 4.8 GHz without a problem, but what also surprised me was that out of the 5 motherboards that I tested, only 2 of them overclocked the memory, the ASUS and the MSI. The MSI overclocked the memory to its maximum potential, but at least it's great that these vendors have implemented or added that extra element to the equation. Guys, let us know your thoughts on auto overclocking, and what do you guys think about the results that I was able to extrapolate with auto overclocking pretty much the same CPU on all the 5 motherboards. Plus also stay tuned for Ryzen because there's a lot of X370 boards that I'd like to check out, but I'm also not so looking forward to that because overclocking a Ryzen processor is way more complicated than Intel, or maybe I don't know, it's something out there. Anyways, stay tuned for that. I'm Eber with Canucks. Don't forget to subscribe for more similar content, and we'll see you in the next one.